What stands in the way of having a deeper faith? On August 5th, 1949, a group of 15 elite U.S. Forest Service smoke jumpers, or airborne firefighters, stepped out of their plane above a remote wildfire in Montana. Within an hour, all but 3 of them were dead or mortally burned. They were caught by flames as they ran uphill through dried grass on a steep slope, trying to reach a higher ridge. The University of Chicago English literature professor, Norman Maclean, who himself had experience as a firefighter, happened to be in town and took the time to visit the fire even as it still burned. The men who perished were mostly in their 20s, and their stories haunted Maclean until he retired from teaching decades later and began writing about them. He begins his book, Young Men and Fire, saying, quote, "The problem of self-identity is not just a problem for the young. It is a problem for all time, perhaps the problem. It should haunt old age, and when it no longer does, it should tell you that you are dead." Maclean found his identity, his self-identity, wrapped up in that tragedy, and so he studied what happened intently. The physics of fire, how a blow-up happens and burns uphill, the geology, weather, terrain, ecology, and botany of that particular river valley and hillside, safety changes that the tragedy inspired at the Forest Service. Maclean notes that from the arrangement of the bodies, rescue crews observed that most men had fallen and gotten up again, maybe a few times. He writes, quote, "At the very end, beyond thought and beyond fear and beyond even self-compassion and divine bewilderment, there remains some firm intention to continue doing forever what we last hoped to do on earth." His last paragraph says, quote, "I, an old man, have written this fire report. It was important to me as an exercise for old age to enlarge my knowledge and spirit so I could accompany young men whose lives I might have lived on their way to death. I have climbed where they have climbed, and in my time I have fought fire and inquired into its nature. I have lived to get a better understanding of myself and those close to me, many of them now dead. I have often found myself thinking of my wife on her brave and lonely way to death." What stands in the way of having a deeper faith? This week in a group, my friend Chris directed this question to me. And at first I didn't say anything and let the conversation just flow. I had in mind the writer Mary Kerr's observation that talking about spiritual activity to a secular audience is like doing card tricks on the radio. But then another friend asked me the same question, and so let me try to answer here. I do not think that the major obstacle to deeper faith has much to do with belief. This is made more complicated, though, because in our time of relative spiritual naivete, many people do not seem to be aware that we have to learn to have an adult faith. Paul writes, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways." Another factor is that many modern people feel that they don't have enough time to go to church or to pray. Their work life and other obligations squeeze everything else out. 20 years ago, Robert Putnam pointed out that instead of joining bowling leagues as they once did, many people are bowling alone. In other words, people are more isolated and not joining groups and civic organizations in the way they once did. Some people may have an idea of who they might meet in church and simply do not want to be around that kind of person. Sorry about that. I can imagine someone with integrity also being afraid that faith would lead to an obligation to take care of other people, and it does. Despair is also a barrier. Some look at the pain in the world and think that God is at fault, or that this somehow proves there is no God. They have never been introduced to a more subtle form of faith in a God who suffers along with us in the person of Jesus. Now, I didn't say any of these things in the conversation. Instead, I offered a short, more inflammatory response, which I have to say I hesitate to share with you this morning. I said, a profound barrier to having faith in our time is rapidly accelerating capitalism. Now, this worldview is so pervasive today that we are living examples of David Foster Wallace's old joke. And you probably remember it. The old fish swims past the two younger ones and says, "How's the water?" And the younger fish swim on for a little bit, and then one turns to the other and says, "What the heck is water?" What I mean by capitalism is an expanding set of values that colonizes our inner life and every domain of our daily experience. This includes the sense that the world is inert or dead, that everything, even Greenland, can be measured objectively and valued. It makes our interactions into transactions. It turns gifts into investments and makes non-work activities somehow seem less valuable even when they are as important as raising children. This kind of consciousness leads us to see ourselves not as God's children, but as insatiable consumers who can never get enough, and others as only means to our own ends. It erodes a sense of gratitude, implies that all good things are earned. It makes radically accelerating inequality seem inevitable, even when it destabilizes our democracy and all other forms of community. Above all, in our case, capitalism is leading to an extreme individualism that does radical damage to human dignity. So in short, this, as you might imagine, it may have done this for you too, but it offended my friends. And so they immediately responded back to me. They said how great life is in the 21st century and how it wasn't that long ago when Americans, more than half of Americans, did not have access to warm showers. And I told them how a society's income inequality is directly correlated with mental illness, and about the misery I encountered that day going twice through the Tenderloin among people suffering so gravely from mental illness and addiction. I have a friend who lives in a small apartment in the city. Yes, she does have a hot shower, but she wants me to call her every week because she is so alone that no one will even notice when she dies. Climate scientist Gus Speth writes, I used to think the top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought with 30 years of good science, we would address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Now, perhaps my friends should have asked an even more interesting question. What can remove these obstacles to faith? And today's gospel is about precisely this. The English translation states that those going out to see John the Baptism were, quote, filled with expectation, unquote. And a much better translation of this would be they were filled with foreboding, filled with dread. Yes, that was not the world of what some would prematurely call late-stage capitalism, but the shocking violence of those times would not be entirely unfamiliar to us. Did you wonder about verses, the short verses that were omitted in our reading, they interject a short reference to King Herod, who later killed John in prison. And yet Luke writes, quote, "John proclaimed the good news to the people." What is this good news? First, even though our inner lives seem thoroughly colonized by a world picture that seems to be leading to the death of our humanity and our planet, we can be changed. The word Luke uses is metanoia. Meta is to change. Nous is like your mind, your spirit, the deepest part of you. It means a change of heart in the deepest sense. It's the word that we translate as repentance, perhaps inadequately. Second, don't be confused and think that there are some people who are wheat and other people who are chaff. Just as a single grain has both parts, each of us do too. And through prayer, we have Jesus' help as we try to separate what is good in our life so that it will thrive from what will minimize the prejudices and destructive thoughts that distort us. Now, finally, let me assure you that deeper than all our thoughts, there is a place within us where we can meet God. That voice speaks quietly to Jesus. It speaks to us too. And if you listen this morning, you will hear in your own way God saying, "You are my child, my beloved. With you I am well pleased." My friends, what stands in the way of having a deeper faith? Not just in general, but for you. The world around us is burning. 153,000 LA County residents are under mandatory evacuation orders, and an area greater than the size of San Francisco has been reduced to ash. Our governor and our next president are publicly feuding. Many of us feel a sense of foreboding, as if we were trapped halfway up a hill, only just above the rising flames. Through a lifetime of studying their story, Norman Maclean saw similarities between those young men, each one knowing he was alone at his death, and Jesus. In Young Men in Fire, Maclean writes about the group's foreman, Wagner Dodge, who lit a safety fire and tried to convince his men to follow him into the protection of the already charred land. Strangely enough, going toward and more deeply into the fire was ultimately what saved his life. And perhaps this is true for us also. Each of us is trying to reach a higher ridge. After we have lived for a better understanding of ourselves and those close to us, we each arrive at the same place. And at the very end, beyond thought and beyond fear and beyond even self-compassion, that is where we meet the one who has climbed everywhere we have climbed, the one who is closer to us than we are to ourselves. And we shall hear the voice of the one who loves us.